The sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already gone. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we know there's days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace.
All right, welcome back to our study of Psalms, everyone. Today we come to Psalm 20, another psalm attributed to David, evidently composed on some occasion when the king is about to go to war, evidently designed to be used by the people and the king to express confidence in God and in one another. So it's a relatively short one today, and bear with me just a bit. I've got the King James Version here that I typically use. As always, taking a few observations from Brother Waycaster's commentary. He uses the American Standard Version, and then I've also got the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh version, so 3 different versions, and also the numbering is different between the verses between JPS and the other two. So hopefully between the numbering and the translation differences, it won't get confusing at all. I don't think so, but just a heads up in case it does. So the most interesting thing about this psalm, we'll come to it in just a second. I suppose. We'll start out by noting that there's a close connection between this psalm, Psalm 20, and the one that follows, Psalm 21. This one is a prayer of the people on behalf of the king, and then the later is a song of victory. Brother Waycaster breaks this one down into 3 parts, or rather it kind of breaks itself down into 3 parts, really. I guess it's more an observation of how the psalm is naturally broken down. You have the first part in verses 1 through 5. You have the people in verses 1 through 4, the king in the first part of verse 5, and then the people in the second part of verse 5, the king in verse 6, and then 7 through 9, a general chorus of all. That breakdown kind of brings me back to what I was about to say a moment ago. The interesting thing about this particular psalm, and I'll just read directly from Brother Waycaster here so I don't misconstrue trying to explain it. It says, "It would appear that the intent of the psalmist was that this psalm would be used by the people and the king in alternate responses. It closes with a type of chorus in which all join in, people and king together. The first 5 verses would be sung in chorus and express the consciousness of the supreme need in the day of trouble. The enemy had gathered, the battle was at hand. The first part of the next verse is a solo. The voice of the king is heard announcing his confidence in Jehovah. The people immediately take up the chorus in the second half of verse 5, and to this, the king responds with a confident affirmation that goodness shall follow, and then the psalm ends with the grand chorus of all." So a little bit different with this psalm. The first one I think that we've come to like this, where you have these kind of alternating voices that's somewhat in a call and response type of a format. But we'll read through it and then take a couple of the observations again from the 2 sources. It reads, "The Lord hear thee in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob defend thee. Send thee help from the sanctuary and strengthen thee out of Zion. Remember all thy offerings and accept thy burnt sacrifice. Grant thee according to thine own heart and fulfill all thy counsel. We will rejoice in thy salvation, and in the name of our God we will set up our banners. The Lord fulfill all thy petitions. Now know I that the Lord saveth his anointed. He will hear him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. They are brought down and fallen, but we are risen and stand upright. Save, Lord. Let the King hear us when we call." Okay, so this psalm starts and ends with this notion of God hearkening unto his people, and it's very similar in the overall tone and purpose other psalms that we've seen up to this point. The idea that the psalmist, or again, psalmist writing on behalf of the people and the king, stand in need of God's help and God's protection. And it's a prayer for the king before battle. Again, that's the general occasion for the psalm. The king's about to go into battle, and this psalm is expressing the desire for God's strength, God's protection of him in that, in success in that effort, and confidence that it will indeed be there. The reference to his anointed in verse 7 makes it clear that this is about the king. And it's worth noting there's an interesting phrase here in the very first verse. The name of the God of Jacob defend thee. It's kind of an odd, you have various names and various names of God used in Scripture, and also various descriptions of God. The God of Jacob is somewhat unusual, likely an allusion to Genesis 35:3, where Jacob builds an altar to the God who answered me when I was in distress, as it's put. And it also stresses here that phrase, the name of the God of Jacob, like Deuteronomy 12:5, for example, that only God's name is present on the earth. And there's also a very clear affinity with Deuteronomy with verse 2 in reference to the sanctuary and strengthening out of Zion, Jerusalem. Right, Deuteronomy famously speaks of the people, the Israelites, going into the land, and they're coming a place where God would cause his name to dwell. Not specified there that it's Jerusalem, but of course we come to find out later on in the historical narrative, yes, it is Jerusalem. And as we've mentioned before, that's where this distinction between Jerusalem and Mount Gerizim comes from, because where's the place that God would cause his name to dwell? Some say Jerusalem, some particularly in the northern tribes say Gerizim. But anyway, here in Psalm 20, we have the very clear allusion to Zion as well, along with the name of Jacob's God. And it's also noted that this may reflect a ritual of sacrificing before going to battle. If you turn over to 1 Samuel 7, 9, and 10, you find a similar occasion there. This idea that battle is upon us. You have this the people crying out on behalf of the king, seeking God's favor, God's strength, and also offering sacrifices alongside in preparation for it. And certainly the strength of God's presence, God's providence over military might is a central biblical theme, especially in the Old Testament. You have numerous accounts in the Old Testament historical narratives in which the Israelites go out to do battle, and God is with them. You have a number of occasions in which they go forth to do battle, or to perhaps during the conquest to conquer a particular city, and they don't follow the directions as they're for example, they're told go out and don't take any of the spoils of war. But someone does. You think of Achan's sin, for example, in which he kept things he ought not to have kept, and so the battle did not go favorably for them. So a very common theme in this psalm fits right alongside that. The idea that the king is about to go into battle. He wants God to be on his side, and again, expressing confidence that God would be. One more interesting thing to note about the text itself, before considering a couple of the lessons from this very brief psalm. The Septuagint reads the final part of this as, "O Lord, grant victory to the king, answer us when we call." Very, very similar to the way the King James renders it, but it's worth noting because according to the JPS commentator, as I always say, take it with a grain of thought. I don't know if this is true or not, but if it is, it's pretty interesting, especially given what we've seen the past week or two with Queen Elizabeth's funeral and the change of monarch in Great Britain. He says that this is actually the origin of the expression "God save the king," or "God save the queen," as most of us have known throughout our lifetimes. But this particular statement from this psalm, going all the way back to the Septuagint translation, is where that phrase, that expression originally came from. So if that's the case, that's kind of an interesting historical tidbit as well to note alongside Psalm 20. Again, whether it is, I don't know. But a couple of lessons that we can take from this. The psalm suggests divine assistance for God's children. Right? We're going into battle. We want to ensure that God is on our side. We should certainly never hesitate to ask to seek God's strength, God's protection, God's wisdom. You might note James 1:5, right? Prayer certainly avails much, and certainly the psalmist on this occasion, I believe, would agree with that. God grants the desires we have so long as they are in accordance with His will. You might note James 4:3 with that connection. It has to be in accordance with God's will. You might also note, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, those occasions in the Israelites' early history in particular where they went into battle, they went to conquer a city, and what they were doing was not in alignment with God's will, and things didn't necessarily work out so very well for them. Another lesson: we can win the battle so long as we remember that we're dependent upon God. A sentiment that we've seen in other psalms up to this point, right? The psalmist, again, usually, if not always in these early psalms, David, understanding that he isn't truly the one winning the fight. David and Goliath being the ultimate example of it. Yes, David is the one out there on the battlefield with Goliath, David has his slings and stones, but he understands that ultimately God is the one giving him the strength. God is the one behind the victory. We're assured of the victory even before the battle starts, right? If God is with us, who can be against us? This psalm is an excellent passage to put alongside that thought. Verse 7, this is one that the Israelites struggled with immensely, especially in the later years, going up against Assyria, Babylon, Egypt. True strength is not in the military power of a nation, but in their relationship to God. Right? Sometimes they would get entangled in military alliances with pagan nations that they should not have been. This is a recurring theme, particularly in Isaiah. They are leaning upon other nations and physical power rather than God, and this is a problem. Again, verse 7: some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. We should pray for those in positions of authority, right? 1 Timothy 2:1 and 2. Here you have a psalm in which you have, again, this these alternating responses between the people and the king, right? Yet certainly the king wants God's favor and God's protection in battle, but the people also want this on behalf of the king. He's the one in authority over them, and they want him to succeed. They want him to be godly and to have God's protection. We ought to be the exact same way. Sometimes the people we find in those positions of authority may not necessarily be the ones we would want to see there, and perhaps there's a little bit of an Ecclesiastes type of thought there, right? Solomon admits as much. Sometimes you have oppression in places of justice. You have people in charge who don't always make godly decisions, and nonetheless, we should pray for those who are in those positions. And then a final lesson to close us out today. The man who trusts in God will be blessed. The man who places his confidence in chariots and horses will be lost eternally. A bit of a metaphor there. I mean, obviously it's quite literal here in Psalm 20. He's about to go into battle. Where's he going to put his trust? But those chariots and horses can be any number of physical things that we can put our trust in rather than God. Money, career, social status, the favor of our fellow humans in this world. There are any number of things that we can choose to rely on, to put our trust in, and just push God to the side and take him out of the picture entirely. The psalmist here understands doing so will not serve him terribly well. He isn't going to put his trust in chariots and in horses like other earthly kings do. And he understands that he will be blessed for it. And there's certainly a lesson there for us as well. All right, so that is Psalm 20, Lord willing. When next we meet, the week after next, Brandy, the family, and I will be out of town next Thursday, but hopefully after that we'll come back and we will continue on with Psalm 21. Thank you very much for your kind attention today.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you'd reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign